The Jetsons 1963, Issue 7. Judy and her friends sing while playing the guitar, and George can't stand it, while Jane doesn't mind their folk singing. They're rehearsing until the school show tomorrow, and George is nervous in the audience there because he doesn't want to see Judy embarrass herself. The audience likes her, and Jane tells George he just doesn't know it's good, and he's still smiling after that, luckily. Jane compliments Judy, and so does George. Out of nowhere, a talent scout from the Ed Sullivan Show invites Judy to be on his show to try to win $500. George faints as if this is a lot of money when earlier he said, another day, another $900, so this would just be $5 to him. It shouldn't seem like a big deal to someone who makes $900 a day. So maybe he's just fainting because a talent scout wants his daughter on a show because she might get famous. So in the following days, he pressures Judy and her friends to overwork themselves rehearsing and tells Judy not to nap. He gets told he's taken all the fun out of her band. He's only done this to them because he thought they were bad in the first place and still won't let go of the worry that the show would think they sucked because he still thinks he's right. He plans to share the reward money with her. Somehow she's singing in her sleep, which might be why on the day she's supposed to go to the studio, she's lost her voice. But I don't want that to be because something happened that wouldn't have happened. Jane tells George it's his fault, and he should be the one who tells the other girls. The story uses the fact that he thought he was a great singer, because he unfortunately thinks he could be a good replacement for Judy. When maybe if Jane told him he's a terrible singer back then, he wouldn't have completely ruined the show for Judy. I hate how easily this could have not happened. It makes the story a missed opportunity. At least Judy's friends actually have the sense to refuse to go on stage with him because they know this will just make a fool out of them. He came here even though he's never played the electric guitar before. Somehow it shocks him because he plugged it into the electro feedbacker. So he screams and randomly strums the guitar. Someone smiles behind him. By sheer miracle, Judy thinks his untalented playing is catchy. And the studio audience likes his act because he never saw anything like it before. No one minds that he was wearing a girl's wig and dress or even comments on it, despite the comic being written in the 60s. And George's accidental dancing wins him the $500. I was wondering a page ago if he'd win anyways because this is a light-hearted series. More trustworthy in tone than what I'm used to dealing with. I guess this makes sense, so I don't mind the incredibly lucky, happy ending when it could have easily just been a downer ending. He gets the money, no big deal. We never learn what he spent it on, and it turns out he invented a new dance for Judy's friends. In the next story, Elroy says to Astro that he doesn't want to be late for the Space Scout hike to Lake Moon. Why does he say we when he should know he can't bring his dog with him? The scout leader tells Elroy to put his gear in the hauler, which hopefully is literally going to bring them to the moon, which has an artificial lake, because otherwise I'd wonder why they're called Space Scouts. Astro hides under stuff on the hauler to stow away, and all of the hikers activate hover shoes. We don't even get to see how they did it. With their minds? It's justified that they'd even want hover shoes that barely float them that high, because the space hikers take the bumps out of mountain trails. The scouts look away from Elroy. He finds Astro and whispers to him to stay out of sight, and he's asked by the leader why he's holding up the blanket. He says he's just airing it out, and somehow gets told good thinking, when I don't see why he should air out a blanket. He was hiding Astro. He covers him with a blanket and does something to inflate a tent to hide him. He plans to give the bones to Astro, as I'm thinking that his hiking experience has been too boring and normal to have a point to it. Astro barks in his sleep. To be fair, some dogs do make noises in their sleep. Elroy barks with his eyes closed in front of him to convince him that he's just doing that in his sleep. But why is he doing this while sitting up? Why is he not questioning this? He decides to give Elroy a pat on the head out of pity. He already pitied him. Why didn't he do this earlier? I hate that he discovers Astro this way, because it could have easily not happened. The leader says it'll tie Astro up in his tent until he could send him home in the morning. At least we don't see him punish Elroy, just Astro. Then Astro notices and chases a rabbit when he's tied up. The leader decides to chase him angrily, and go figure there's going to be a benefit to Astro being here that'll make him warm up to him, because he finds out the scouts didn't put out the campfire, causing a little fire in the bush. So he puts out the fire, decides to have a fire safety meeting tomorrow, and makes Astro an honorary scout so he could stay for saving them by accident. Even though that was clearly going to be the last time he was going to be useful to them and would otherwise just act like a dog. In the next story, George says he hopes he'll get a promotion and wants to go to work early to make a good impression. Then Rosie says she's going out shopping as a mere cover because she wants to try to make sure George will get his promotion. This just makes me worry. How is she supposed to know how to help him? The secretary apologizes to her, saying that Spacely is busy. She amusingly says he's not because she sees him trying to play golf in his office, so must not have anything breakable there. She should have known that demanding his boss to promote him would cause him to say he doesn't like being bossed around and wonder if Jetsons sent her. She was somehow surprised to learn that humans don't want to be pushed around. She gets spotted by George and tells him she brought his dessert. He's thankful, and it turns out she always keeps some goodies handy for the kids, which is why she had this cake. George says Rosie's the best cook in the world, so he decides to invite Spacely home for some of her cooking to suck up to him. Rosie gets nervous and disguises herself. Spacely would assume this is Rosie because she's a robot with the same general shape and size as her, and he must have met her in the show before. Didn't he complain that he didn't know George had the money to hire a maid when he first met her? And wouldn't he complain about what Rosie did to George? This is only believable because a human would think all robots look kind of alike. But how would that still be the case in a future full of robots? Spacely thanks her for offering to take his hat and coat, and comments on her veil, which he'd know no maid bots wear. So wouldn't he be confused? You'd think he'd instantly know it's Rosie in a disguise because George calls her Rose. This would only be believable if he knew it was Rosie and was trying to be patient with her, because he would definitely already know she's a great cook. So now it's not the time to get mad at her. Or this could be a parallel universe where he hasn't seen Rosie in his apartment before. Realistically, he says this is the 6th time he's had dinner at an employee's house since he announced that he was going to promote someone. Good, now I know why I even said that. Justifying the story. Rosie presses a button on the wall, making the silver platters go up to a magnet above them. Spacely says it's genius, and Jane gives her the credit. Spacely's happy to get his favorite dish, and Rosie explains that she found out what his favorite dish was by calling his maid. Spacely says that the French make maid bots better just based on one robot. He says he likes old-fashioned robot maid cooking. An amusing line for implying that robot maids were a thing for generations. The whole time I've been dreading the moments where he'd stop smiling. He says he might have one more taste of beef. Oh no, I feel like he could have easily decided not to do this. He says it's efficient that the table was already cleared, and she was actually smart enough to already have 2 beef sandwiches wrapped and ready for him to take home. George praises her, and then out of nowhere, Spacely pulls up her veil because he just has to see the face responsible for all of this. When he should know it's rude to do that if she wanted that veil the whole time, and not punish her for being such a good worker. I hate this because he could have easily not done this. He complains that this is the robot who asked him to promote him. George says her name in a scolding way, but when she admits it was all her fault, which was already obvious, he says she's courageous, honest, and loyal, and shakes his hand. He says this caused them to know who to pick as the new chief of buttons, Rosie, despite her having no apparent experience with the job. I get him wanting to punish George for having a robot that demanded him to promote him, so of course George wouldn't get the promotion. After all, it was Rosie doing all the impressive things, so he didn't deserve it. But obviously he wouldn't be able to hire someone with no resume, education, and experience, robot or not. So there's a downer ending where Rosie tells George to not be so hard on those buttons, as if she could possibly tell from all the way across the room. At least it's new to see her like this, even if it has no future story potential, as we've already seen everything we could from it. That combined with the fact that it'd be illegal to hire her justifies why she won't be in this job next story. In the next story, somehow George refuses to take the lunch from his wife to work. I didn't see this in an Archie comic from the 50s. She says he'll accept it because he's been complaining about expenses and this is a great way to save $7 a week. That's nothing compared to $900 that he makes in a day. Why'd he have just said that as a joke, when I'd expect him to think he's not being paid enough by a guy like Spacely? Somehow, I'm supposed to believe all of the other guys at work laugh at him for having a lunch from his wife. I don't get it. Why would they think this is effeminate when it's normal for the wife to prepare meals for her husband? Jane says this will save money because all of the guys at work eat out every time there's a lunch break. She also says that she made his favorite. I doubt there to be a variety of cheese that could only be made on the moon. So I guess it's only a brand name that started because it was first made on the moon. Then we see a bank robber with a paper bag of loot stash it in a bush, even though banknotes are marked. And if they weren't back then, they definitely would be in the future. So the government would track it down. He wouldn't think it'd be safe there until he'd come back later, when he'd be lucky if he could make it there without being arrested. The mask only covers a little of his face, so it wouldn't be good enough. He bumps into George, and their bags get switched by mistake. Spacely wonders what George is hiding from below his office window walls, and jokes, maybe he's bombing the place because I didn't give him a raise. For the most part, I like him in this comic. He doesn't threaten George about firing in every issue he's in. He looks like a jerk, but he's usually sort of sympathetic and relatable for a boss. He eventually finds the money in the bag and sees a band around the dollars saying Century Bank, and he says he heard the bank was robbed on the news. Wait, why did he have the time to watch the news? Isn't he a busy CEO? He thankfully says poor George and wants to give him a chance to redeem himself, blaming himself for not giving him a raise. He invites George to his office and says he's unaware that there were two bags. All he does is waste time instead of immediately opening the bag to confront him with the fact that he knows there's money in it, like he could easily do. George says it's not illegal to bring your lunch, and Spacely would demand him to open his bag after this, not say, "Don't alibi to me," because he'd want to prove he's a liar. George walks away. Spacely calls the police on him as I wish it was explained that he was expecting reward money for this, since it's not really his business. And George ends up chased by the cops who think he was bribing them for offering to split it with them. He looks in the bag at last and faints. The bank robber finds his lunch bag so George can't. He gets sent to jail and a Deus Ex Machina happens because he smells his lunch outside of the jail window. There was absolutely no reason for the robber to go just outside of his window. It's not like he knew the bag of money was here. He says he can't figure out how $500,000 turned into sandwiches. Plus, you'd think all the police would have to do is look at the camera footage of the bank to instantly know that George doesn't look anything like the bank robber. George uses the bed sheets as a lasso around the robber and calls for the police, who recognize the robber on sight. So I guess the only reason George was in trouble was because they thought he was knowingly keeping marked banknotes. The chief thankfully apologizes to George and even gives him a reward, causing Jane to say she told him she'd save him some money. George orders some big sandwiches at the restaurant his coworkers go to in front of them, and somehow this causes one of them to say he'll start bringing his lunch, even though obviously there's no chance that he could have the same good luck. And the restaurant would serve the same thing that this guy could make for lunch. And how would they know that this is what George would want to bring for lunch if he was having his wife make his lunch? The first story was about Judy's new band being invited to play on a show for a prize, and George overworking them, rehearsing them until Judy loses her voice. Because apparently he's that greedy that he'd do this for a mere 2/3 at best of an amount of money that's half of what he makes in a day. The only thing that took advantage of it being the future was that he shocked himself plugging the electric guitar into something. And that something sounded like a bunch of techno babble, but at the same time it was an electric guitar, which we have. So because this doesn't take advantage of it being in the future, normally this would be one of the worst Jetsons stories. So it's a good thing there was practically nothing wrong with it. It was mostly believable. He lucked out by winning when he was impersonating Judy because he didn't have any talent. But I guess it could be possible that he'd be so entertaining by how untalented and silly he's being that he'd be awarded the money for that. The second story was about Astro stowing away with Elroy on his hiking trip with the Boy Scouts and eventually getting the leader to like him. Because when he chases a rabbit and gets the leader's attention at night, he discovers he didn't put out the campfire yet. That still doesn't have it make sense that he let Astro stay, because a normal dog can only do dog things, not scout things. The only sci-fi in the story was the hover shoes and their helmets. But it made sense for the most part, so it's still technically great. Rosie's story was about Rosie having the uncharacteristically risky idea to demand Spacely to promote George. What maid would do that? I thought she was gonna do stuff to suck up to him, like clean up the office, taking advantage of her being a maid bot. However, because of the wonderful work she does as a maid and chef when he's invited to George's house for dinner, which he would have done anyways, it doesn't actually matter that she was bossy to him, because he conveniently gets impressed by her admitting that it was her idea, not George's, to boss him around. Maybe because he was already so impressed by her being a good chef that he realistically didn't forget it just because it was Rosie. But wouldn't she have told him it was her idea to boss him around right after he got mad about it? I would say her bossing around Spacely didn't need to be in the plots because it would have gone the same way regardless until maybe the ending. But it did provide some necessary tension to make the plot engaging, because you spend the whole dinner scene waiting for Spacely to find out it's her. And it was so forced that he found out because he wouldn't have lifted her veil, because that'd be rude. He would have assumed it was Rosie from the start because of her size and shape, and I'm sure a maid bot can't disguise her voice. So it would have made sense if he always knew it was her and just forgave her as soon as he saw that she was so nervous as to disguise herself. The final story, which also doesn't really take advantage of it being in the future, has a bank robber's bag get switched with George's lunch bag, and Spacely sees George hide his bag in the bush so that the co-workers won't see him with it. Because somehow he thinks they'd have made fun of him for having it. So he calls the cops on him. Easily one of my least favorite stories. The bank robber gets George's lunch bag, and for no reason at all, he ends up below George's jail cell window when he wasn't there to gloat at him, when he had no idea that his bag of money was here, or that there was any chance he could get it back without getting arrested in the attempt if he did know. George smells his lunch and uses his bed sheets to lasso the bad guy and get some reward money for catching another criminal. I guess basically called the cops on George because he wanted that reward money. You'd think the story wouldn't have gotten to the point where he called the cops on him because he would have forced George to open the bag in front of him when he called it his lunch, causing George to freak out in front of him, and then proceed to lead him to his actual lunch bag before the robber would have found it. Not to mention Spacely would have just come out and said that he saw banknotes right away for the sake of threatening him as much as he could. He already asked if he had anything to say for himself, so it's not like he was trying to play dumb. This plot could be in any sitcom. You could replace the space mobiles with cars with no difference in the plot. And it's a frustrating story too because of how it goes poorly when Spacely confronts George, so it's not worth it even with the happy ending. I'm bewildered that in the entire issue, early in the comic, there wasn't a single story that had futuristic technology be mandatory for the plot. Of course, Rosie never counts because she could be replaced with a human maid for the same plot. Although I guess sci-fi technology was needed for Spacely to become impressed with Rosie, or maybe he would have been impressed with her even if she was a normal maid, because her cooking would be so great, and she found out what his favorite dish was.